Okay, so this is Unit 5C, Part 3 continues. This is just a slight, this being a slightly longer lecture series than normal. So, back in the United States, two-thirds of all Americans were adamantly against joining World War II. They had a bad taste from World War One. At the time, the U.S. Army ranked 17th in the world. That is smaller than the nation of Belgium, so it's not like the U.S. was ready for a war. The USA had passed neutrality acts, making it illegal for the U.S. to sell supplies to the fighting countries. Now, that did change with the Lend-Lease Act in early 1941 after the fall of France. The USA started to intervene a little bit more. They would sell and loan guns and boats to Great Britain. So clearly, the United States is favoring the Allied side, just as they had in World War One. But again, they're avoiding war as much as possible. That obviously changed December 7th, 1941. Uh, so USA in 1940 had declared an embargo on Japan that had cut them off from key oil and steel resources, which again, well, from what we understand with industrialized Japan, Japan needed those resources, especially wartime Japan, who's currently fighting in China. Japan was also rapidly expanding and was hoping to acquire the American Philippines at the time as well. So, December 7th, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Um, I say surprise in air quotes because any realistic military leader at that time saw that a conflict with Japan was coming. They just didn't know exactly when. Um, that that the attack by the carrier strike planned to coincide with the Japanese declaration of war. It destroyed much, but not all, of the American Pacific Fleet. USA lost over 2,300 servicemen, a giant portion of their fleet, and it rapidly changes American feeling towards war and pulls America into World War II, um, which is especially significant considering how it has been going so proly positive for the Axis. We didn't talk about the Japan in the last video. Japan is doing almost just as well as Germany has been doing. Japan has taken all of Korea, all of northeast China, and is pushing deep into China, and has conquered most of the coastal territory. At this point, taking the Philippines, Indonesia, has pushed into Southeast Asia. They have acquired a massive Japanese empire, rivaled only by what Germany has done, and the two of them are allied. So USA had a decision to make where to go first. They could use their resources against Japan. They could use the resources against Germany, and the decision was Germany first. USA and Great Britain decided that Hitler was more of a threat, and the hope was to keep Japan at bay with the U.S. military while sending everything else against Germany. And so ultimately, that's why Germany became the focal point of the American war effort, at least to start. So what happened next? Churchill and Roosevelt agreed to work together, combine war plans, and so you have a unified force of the USA slash Great Britain. They're also allied with the Soviet Union, but that's happening on the other part of the world. So, speaking of the Soviet Union, what's going on between Germany and the Red Army, which is the Soviet Union? You have some of the worst battles in human history. First, you have the battle, or it's really the siege of Leningrad. Hitler ordered the city to be surrounded and its population wiped out with starvation. The Soviet soldiers and citizens will surround and cut off the city for 872 days. That's 2.5 years before Germany's finally pushed back. This will lead to 1.5 million casualties, both military and civilian. You have extreme cases of people having to eat rats, people resorting to cannibalism. The Nazis essentially were trying to conquer the city of Leningrad, which is the modern city of St. Petersburg, by the way, without having to physically invade it. Moscow, to the Nazis, was the prize because that was the capital of the Soviet Union. So German plan was to quickly capture the Soviet capital, thinking it would end the war, which it very well might have. The initial German success brought Germany to within 25 miles of the city center, which again, with your mechanized tanks and trucks, that's about a day's ride away. The German army, though, was brought to a grinding halt because they were low on supplies. The Soviets were counterattacking ruthlessly, and the Russian winter, when you know it, was back again with its full rage. But then you had the Battle of Stalingrad a year later after the invasion. Stalin determines, this is our last stand, famously declares not one step back. And he means that literally. Any Soviet soldier that retreated would be shot by fellow Soviet soldiers, being viewed as cowards. And if you did not shoot a fellow Soviet soldier, you could be shot because you did not do your duty of the not one step back mentality. The battle lasts over 5 months. The German army is eventually surrounded. They break, they surrender, and this cripples the German military. And it's the true turning point of World War II. Whenever anyone says D-Day is the turning point of World War II, it's big. D-Day is huge. That is not the turning point. Stalingrad is, in my opinion, the undisputed turning point of World War II. Casualties for Stalingrad reach above 2 million. It is the bloodiest battle in human history. I mean, again, you are seeing the casualties that the Soviets are incurring, and the Germans too are incurring against each other are massive. And while this is going on, the USA has joined World War II, but they have yet to actually send troops into Europe. And it's going to take a couple years. And when we talk Unit 6 about the Cold War, there's a significance there. So, speaking of D-Day, though, so 2 years after the Battle of Stalingrad, 3 years after, 2.5 years after the USA joins World War II, it's the largest amphibious water invasion in history. The USA and Great Britain invade German-occupied France to get a toehold in Europe. Why did they do this? One was to open a second front to the war and help the Soviet Union against Germany. It's going to force the Nazis to pull soldiers away from this Eastern Soviet front to take on the American and the British and the Western front, and to break Hitler's control of Germany. It is one of the largest assaults. It is the largest assault that has ever been conducted. The amount of time and coordination that was put into this was on a monstrous scale. USA and Britain suffered massive casualties, but it did open up a second front against Germany. And the Battle of Stalingrad was the turning point, but D-Day was the end point. After D-Day, there's pretty much no hope for a German victory. And so you have the Allied forces coming in from all sides. So after Stalingrad, the Soviet Union is pushing Germany back. After D-Day, they opened up a toehold in France, and they're pushing back Germany, and they liberate France too. And once they're able to do that, now you have the revitalized French army who's added into the fray. And also in North Africa, the Americans and British liberate North Africa, and they push up through Italy, and they're pushing up through Greece. And so Germany is surrounded on all sides, and they finally collapse. So that is the end of the Nazi Party and Hitler in Europe. It was as the Soviets were closing in, and I mean closing in like within a couple miles of the city center of Berlin. Hitler commits suicide in a bunker underneath the city, and unfortunately, Hitler fought to the very end, which extended the war and death toll probably a year beyond what it should have. The writing was, Hitler's command knew once France had been liberated, it was clear that the Allies were going to win this war, but Hitler forced the war to extend another year, which only increased the death toll by millions. So in 1945, at the Yalta Conference, so the Allied powers realize they're going to win, and so they need to start figuring out what happens next. And they're not talking about Japan, because that has to be dealt with as well. But what about post-World War II? Because we saw post-World War I, if you don't fix your previous problems, this can come right back to you. And so the nations are realizing we have to learn from our mistakes. So FDR, Churchill, and Stalin, which are three fascinatingly different individuals, meet in Yalta to discuss the post-world plan for the world. And the three leaders agree to, one, they have to partition Germany into zones of occupation with the intention of eventually reestablishing a free and democratic Germany. They agreed that liberated nations of Europe should be allowed free and fair election or democracy. The Soviet Union stated that they were going to have spheres of influence in Europe to help protect it from future invasion. The Soviet Union has just been invaded in back to back world wars. They don't want that happening again. And a new international organization will be formed to keep the world safe, the United Nations, which will learn from the previous mistakes of the League of Nations. So the United Nations is not going to have the same problems that the League of Nations had. For one, the United States will be a part of the United Nations, as will a soon to be established Germany, but that's going to take time because they're going to make sure Germany is rebuilt and all fascism and Nazism is absolutely gone. Uh, but technically, the war's not over. So there was the issue of Japan, who still was not surrendering. However, we all know the official ending. Japan will continue to fight for 3 more months until the USA drops 2 atomic bombs on Japan, which shocks the emperor into ending the war. And this is the official end of World War II, but also the immediate start of the nuclear age Cold War. And we'll talk about that with Unit 6. The moment World War II ends, you are immediately going into a potentially new conflict with the Cold War, which could become World War III. Up to this point, it hasn't, but some of the things were solved from World War II that weren't from World War One, but certainly not all of them. There's going to be more that we're going to talk about in class. We're going to talk more about the atomic bomb in class. I don't want you to feel like I'm glossing over it. Obviously, the Holocaust wasn't mentioned at all. That's going to be completely done in class. But this just give you a brief overview, World War II, start to finish.